In row 23C, Keisha Washington slowly opened her eyes. At 34, she had learned to sleep anywhere, a habit developed during years of missions where rest was a rare luxury. But something in the desperation of that voice made her sit up instantly. Beside his wife, businessman Richard Blackwood adjusted his imported glasses and muttered, as if anyone qualified would be traveling in economy class. His disdainful gaze swept over Keisha, who was wearing simple jeans and a basic blouse, her natural hair tied back in an uncomplicated ponytail. Turbulence shook the plane violently as rain hammered the windows with deafening force. Among the 312 passengers, panic was beginning to set in. Children cried, people prayed aloud, and some were already typing farewell messages on his cell phones. "Please," James' voice cracked over the intercom, "anyone with military aviation training, identify yourself immediately. We are flying blind through a Category 5 storm and I've never faced anything like this alone." Keisha stood still for a moment, watching the terrified faces around her. She noticed how no one considered her a possibility. To them, she was just another ordinary passenger, a black woman traveling alone, probably visiting family or returning from some simple job. Richard Blackwood stood up abruptly. "Listen here, kid," he yelled toward the cockpit. "His brother-in-law is a private pilot. I've flown with him dozens of times. I can help." A flight attendant came running over. "Sir, we need someone with specific military experience. Civilian training isn't enough for these conditions." "Are you doubting me?" Richard puffed out his chest, her arrogance intact even in the face of chaos. "I paid $15,000 for these first-class seats. I have more experience than anyone else on this plane." It was then that Keisha stood up quietly. Her movements were fluid, precise, unlike the desperate agitation of the other passengers. As she walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, some passengers watched her with curiosity, others with obvious skepticism. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant, her calm voice contrasting sharply with the chaos around her. "Colonel Keisha Washington, Air Force. 500 hours of flight time in F-22 Raptors, expert in navigation under extreme conditions." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Blackwood stared at her in utter disbelief, his mouth open in shock. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. But in Keisha's eyes was something that made the flight attendant take a step back. An absolute calm that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms and lived to tell the tale. Something that suggested well-kept secrets and a silent strength that was about to be revealed. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple passenger would turn the most terrifying flight of his lives into the most epic demonstration of why we should never judge someone by their appearance. Richard Blackwood's bitter laughter echoed through the cabin as the storm continued to batter the Boeing 747. "Colonel? You?" He gestured dismissively toward her. "Look, I respect our military, but I'm not going to bet my life on a fantasy. My wife and I paid a fortune for these seats precisely to avoid situations like this." Other passengers began to murmur among themselves. An elderly lady in first class whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is she really qualified? She looks so young." The subtext was clear and painful. James Wilson appeared at the cabin door, his face pale with terror. "Please, anyone with military experience needs to come forward now. Captain Mitchell is having seizures, and I've never flown solo in conditions like this." Her voice broke on the last word. "Listen here, young man," Richard stood up again, puffing out his chest. "I've flown in private jets all over Europe. I have over 200 hours of experience as a passenger in luxury aircraft. I know all the procedures." Keisha remained silent for a moment, observing the dynamic. She had learned during years of military service that certain battles had to be chosen carefully. But when she saw the genuine despair in the young co-pilot's eyes, something inside her awakened, the same force that had sustained her during impossible missions in hostile territory. "Mr. Wilson," she said calmly, "I need to know our current altitude, speed, and exact weather conditions." "We're at 38,000 feet, speed 450 knots, crosswinds of 120 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 160, James replied automatically, recognizing the authority in her voice. Richard let out a cruel laugh. "Impressive. She memorized some numbers from Wikipedia. That doesn't make her a pilot." It was then that Keisha did something that silenced the entire cabin. Without hesitation, she began to recite, emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude, immediate oxygen mask, emergency descent to 10,000 feet, descent angle not exceeding 15 degrees to avoid structural stress, communication with air traffic control code 7700. She continued for another 2 minutes, detailing procedures that only highly trained military pilots would know by heart. The ensuing silence was broken only by the roar of the storm. James Wilson stared at her with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Ma'am, the cabin is his." But Richard Blackwood wasn't finished. 1 minute. Anyone can memorize procedures. I demand to see proper credentials before I entrust my life to someone who clearly does not belong in first class on an international flight. The words cut through the air like blades. Other passengers avoided eye contact, embarrassed but unwilling to confront the powerful man. Keisha felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same one she had experienced countless times during her military career, when she had to prove her competence twice as much as any man or white colleague. For a moment, memories flooded her mind. The first time she was questioned during a combat mission, when a white colonel publicly doubted her ability to lead a fighter formation. The time he was passed over for a promotion despite having the best flight record in her class. The whispered comments about racial quotas that had followed him throughout his career. But he also remembered what had made him the most decorated pilot of his generation, the ability to turn every doubt into fuel, every insult into motivation, every underestimation into a strategic advantage. "Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, her voice laden with a calm that made some passengers shiver, "there are 3 kinds of pilots in this world: those who fly when it's easy, those who fly when it's hard, and those who fly when it's impossible." She took a step toward the cockpit, then stopped. "During my career, he has saved 17 aircraft in situations that the manuals said were unrecoverable. But what really qualifies him for this moment is not his medals or flight hours." The plane dove violently, causing several passengers to scream. Keisha didn't even brace herself, maintaining her balance with the ease of someone who had faced turbulence far worse than atmospheric storms. "What qualifies me," she continued, "is that I am the only person on this plane who has ever flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a destroyed navigation system, and missiles being fired at my aircraft. And I still brought my entire squadron home." Keisha nodded and began walking toward the cockpit. But before passing Richard, she turned one last time. "Mr. Blackwood, when we reach the ground, and we will, perhaps he will reflect on how a black woman who doesn't belong in first class saved her life and that of her family." While she disappeared into the cockpit, the passengers fell silent. Some began to realize that they might have witnessed something much greater than a simple air emergency. And Richard Blackwood, for the first time in decades, felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the painful and inevitable feeling of being completely devastatingly wrong about someone whose worth he had underestimated based purely on prejudices that now seemed not only cruel but dangerously stupid. What none of his knew was that Keisha Washington carried with her not only exceptional flying skills, but also a personal history that would make every condescending word they had heard bitterly ironic. A history that, when revealed, would forever change the way everyone on that plane viewed courage, competence, and the true meaning of heroism. Inside the cockpit, Keisha Washington was faced with a situation that would have sent any commercial pilot into a full-blown panic. Captain Mitchell was convulsing violently in his seat, foam coming out of her mouth as the heart monitors blared deafening alarms. James Wilson was literally frozen in terror, her hands shaking over controls she could no longer operate. "First aid now," Keisha ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. She checked the captain's vital signs with the precision of someone who had treated wounded pilots in combat zones. "We have approximately 15 minutes before he goes into full cardiac arrest." James watched him work, impressed by how economical and precise his movements were. "Colonel, how do you know so much about emergency medicine?" 10 years flying rescue missions in hostile territory," she replied, adjusting the navigation instruments while simultaneously monitoring the captain's vital signs. "When he's the only person between a wounded soldier and death, he learns a few things." Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, Richard Blackwood had convinced half of first class that they were all doomed because of an imposter at the controls. "Did you see how she was dressed? Qualified people don't travel like that," he muttered to anyone willing to listen. "I bet she doesn't even have a valid pilot's license." His wife Victoria, who had been silent until then, finally confronted him. "Richard, stop it. You're being ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" He turned to her, indignant. "I'm trying to save our lives. I'm not going to leave our safety in the hands of someone who clearly doesn't. Her words were interrupted by the sound of Keisha's voice over the intercom, now assuming full command. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Washington speaking. I will be taking command of this aircraft until we reach our destination. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the crew. The authority in her voice was unmistakable. It was not the tone of someone trying to convince or impress, but of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Even Richard felt an involuntary chill. In the cockpit, Keisha had transformed James Wilson from a paralyzed co-pilot into an efficient assistant. James, I need you to monitor our fuel and pressurization systems. I'm going to get us out of this storm, but I need accurate information every 30 seconds. Yes, ma'am, James replied, her confidence returning for the first time since the emergency began. There was something about Keisha's presence that made he believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get out of this alive. Then she did something that left James completely perplexed. Instead of following standard emergency routes, Keisha began mentally calculating a trajectory that seemed impossible, flying through the storm instead of trying to get around it. Colonel, with all due respect, this goes against all safety protocols, James protested, watching the calculations she scribbled on a notepad. Keisha smiled for the first time since taking command. James, let me tell you something. In 2018, I was leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan when our aircraft was hit by surface-to-air missiles. 2 engines failed, the navigation system was destroyed, and a sandstorm reduced visibility to 0. She continued flying as she spoke, her hands moving over the controls with mesmerizing fluidity. The manual said to eject and abandon the mission. But there were 17 wounded soldiers depending on us. So he did exactly what he's doing now. He threw the manual out the window and trusted his experience. And what happened? I brought them all home. All 17 of them. Her words carried a weight that made James understand he was in the presence of someone truly exceptional. Sometimes, James, following the rules kills people. Knowing the rules well enough to break them at the right time is what separates mediocre pilots from pilots who save lives. At that moment, the cabin door swung open. Richard Blackwood had managed to convince a flight attendant to let him through, claiming he had relevant experience to assess the situation. This is utter madness, he declared, observing Keisha's unconventional calculations. You're putting us all in danger. I demand to speak to air traffic control immediately. Keisha didn't even turn to look at him. Mr. Blackwood, this cockpit is no place for tourists. Please return to your seat. Tourist. Richard's voice rose an octave. I've flown in more private jets than his entire life. I know aviation, and what he's doing is collective suicide. That's when something interesting happened. Dr. Patricia Chun, chief of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, who had remained quiet until that moment, got up from first class and walked to the cockpit. Colonel Washington, she said calmly, I'm Dr. Chun, a neurosurgeon. I worked for 3 years in military hospitals treating pilots with neurological injuries. I can help with Captain Mitchell. Keisha finally turned around, and the two professionals recognized each other instantly, not personally, but as people who had dedicated their lives to saving others in extreme conditions. Doctor, it would be an honor to have him with us. The captain is stable at the moment, but we need constant monitoring. Richard watched this exchange with growing frustration. You're all crazy. This is a conspiracy to kill us. Dr. Chun looked at he with the patience of someone who had dealt with hysterical family members during medical crises. Mr. Blackwood, I've treated hundreds of military pilots. This woman has the kind of training that no amount of money can buy. I suggest you trust her. Trust. Richard laughed bitterly. Based on what? Her word. It was then that Keisha did something that completely changed the dynamics of the situation. Without stopping flying, she said calmly, James, please tune to military emergency frequency 121.5 and identify our position to Andrews Air Force Base. Colonel Washington to Andrews Base, requesting identity confirmation for civil emergency, she said into the radio. The response came immediately. Colonel Washington? Spectre? Is that really his? This is Commander Rodriguez, Military Air Traffic Control. We confirm his identity. Spectre, you disappeared from radar 20 minutes ago. The entire Air Force is mobilized looking for him. The cabin fell completely silent. Richard Blackwood turned pale, finally realizing that he had completely misjudged one of the most decorated pilots in American military history. Andrews Air Force Base, Keisha continued. We have a simultaneous medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated, flying through an unforeseen storm system. Requesting coordinates for emergency landing at the nearest airport with Boeing 747 capability. Spectre, he has top priority. All airspace on the East Coast has been cleared for you. We have emergency medical equipment being directed to Baltimore International Airport. Dr. Chun smiled discreetly when he saw Richard's expression. Do you know many tourists who have the entire Air Force mobilized to help them, Mr. Blackwood? But what none of them knew was that this emergency was just beginning. In the next few minutes, Keisha Washington would have to use not only her elite piloting skills, but also secret knowledge acquired during classified missions that even his military superiors did not fully know about. And when the true extent of her capabilities was revealed, Richard Blackwood would discover that he had underestimated not only an exceptional pilot, but a true living legend of American military aviation, someone whose story would forever change his view of competence, courage, and the true meaning of heroism. Andrews Base to Spectre, we have critical information, Commander Rodriguez's voice echoed through the cockpit. The weather system is intensifying beyond all predictions. Winds of 180 kilometers per hour, hail the size of baseballs. All airports in the region are closing their runways. You are the only aircraft still in the air. The reality of the situation hit Richard Blackwood like a punch in the stomach. They weren't just another commercial flight with technical problems. They were literally flying through a meteorological apocalypse that had closed all airspace on the East Coast. James, her calmly, I'm going to need him to monitor our vertical speed. We're going to do something that has never been attempted in a Boeing 747. Her hands danced over the controls with a precision that made it seem as if the aircraft was an extension of his own body. Colonel, what exactly are we going to do? James asked, watching indicators that suggested maneuvers impossible for a commercial aircraft of that size. Controlled spiral descent through the eye of the storm, he replied, beginning to perform mental calculations that left both James and Dr. Chun impressed. A technique developed for military fighter jets, never attempted in a civilian aircraft of this size. Richard felt his legs buckle. During her business career, she had met some truly exceptional people, but never anyone operating at such an advanced level of competence that it seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Spectre, another military controller's voice interrupted. This is General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Air Operations Command. We have confirmed that it was his mission to save 2 other aircraft during Operation Tempest Shield in 2019. Is it true that you guided a malfunctioning C-130 through a sandstorm using only radio communication? Affirmative, General. Similar situation, different atmospheric variables, Keisha replied as she simultaneously adjusted flight angles that made his Boeing 747 dance through air currents that should have destroyed any aircraft. James was speechless. Colonel, you saved other planes just by giving instructions over the radio? 17 aircraft throughout her military career, she confirmed, her concentration unshaken. When he learns to see atmospheric patterns in 3 dimensions, he can guide anything that flies, even without being physically at the controls. It was at that moment that Richard Blackwood had a devastating epiphany about the true extent of his ignorance. Her, he had judged based on appearances, was not just a competent pilot, she was a living legend of military aviation, someone whose skills were studied in academies around the world. Dr. Chun, said Keisha, I need you to monitor Captain Mitchell. What I'm about to do in the next few minutes will subject us all to G-forces that could affect his medical condition. Understood, Colonel. He's stable, but you're right about the G-forces. General Hayes, Keisha continued over the radio, requesting confirmation that all civilian aircraft have been directed to alternate airports. I don't want anyone trying to follow our trajectory. Spectre, you are the only thing flying in American airspace right now. We have 13 military bases monitoring her situation. The President has been personally briefed. Richard felt the world spinning around him. The President of the United States was being informed about the flight he was traveling on, piloted by a woman he had tried to disqualify based on racial prejudice. James, I need you to take over communications with air traffic control while I execute the descent, Keisha instructed. I'm going to need total concentration on the next maneuvers. Colonel Washington, Richard finally spoke, her voice broken with humiliation, I need to apologize. What I said was... Mr. Blackwood, she interrupted him without diverting her attention from the controls, your apologies can wait. Right now, I need to save his life and everyone else's on board. The aircraft began a spiral descent that defied all the laws of commercial aeronautical physics. Keisha had found a descending column in the center of the storm, a relatively stable air tunnel that would allow for a controlled descent below the layer of severe turbulence. My God, James murmured, watching the instruments. How did you know that current existed? 10 years flying through hostile weather systems in the Middle East, she replied. Sandstorms, man-made hurricanes created by explosions, conditions that don't exist in civilian manuals. When you survive the impossible repeatedly, the extraordinary becomes routine. Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez. We're seeing her trajectory on radar. This is impossible. How are you keeping an aircraft of this size stable while descending 4,000 feet per minute? Applied physics, Commander. And 17 years of experience turning impossible situations into safe landings. Richard watched through the window as he descended through the eye of the storm. Lightning streaked across the walls of clouds around him like apocalyptic fireworks, but the aircraft remained strangely stable, as if guided by forces beyond normal human comprehension. General Hayes, Keisha called over the radio, requesting coordinates for Dover Air Force Base. We'll need a runway with full emergency capability and medical personnel on standby. Spectre, Dover is ready. Main runway cleared, emergency foam being applied, ambulances in position. He has absolute priority over all airspace. James, when we touch down, you'll see why they call me Spectre, said Keisha, a barely perceptible smile touching her lips for the first time since she had taken command. Over the next 15 minutes, Richard Blackwood would witness a display of technical skill and personal courage that would completely redefine his understanding of competence, leadership, and the true meaning of heroism. And when they finally touched down, he would discover that Keisha Washington was not only one of the best pilots in American military history, she was someone whose personal story of overcoming adversity would make every prejudiced word he had ever uttered a bitter and unforgettable irony. What none of the passengers yet knew was that this landing would change not only her life, but also his civil aviation policies, emergency protocols, and the way the whole world would see what a truly exceptional person can achieve when underestimated by those who confuse privilege with competence. 6 months after the miraculous landing, Keisha Washington was promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony at the Pentagon, becoming the youngest black woman in history to achieve such a rank. Her storm navigation technique was incorporated into military training manuals worldwide, and 3 universities offered chairs in her name. General Washington saved not only 312 lives that day, the Secretary of Defense declared during the ceremony, she redefined how we evaluate competence versus appearance in our armed forces. In the audience, Dr. Patricia Chun applauded enthusiastically. She had co-authored an article with Keisha on emergency aviation medicine, published in the world's most prestigious medical journal. James Wilson, now a captain, commanded his own commercial aircraft, always crediting Keisha as her greatest inspiration. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood faced the reality of his choices. The video of his prejudiced comments during the emergency had leaked on social media, going viral with over 50 million views. Her investment firm lost 80% of its clients in 3 months, forcing him to file for personal bankruptcy. "Daddy, why do people get mad when they see your name on Google?" asked her 12-year-old daughter, innocently destroying what remained of his pride. Victoria had filed for divorce, taking half of the remaining assets and full custody of the children. "I married a man who admired success," she told the judge. "I discovered that I had lived for 15 years with someone who confuses privilege with competence." Richard now worked as a salesman at a used car dealership, using public transportation, the same ordinary life he had once despised. Every morning, he passed a giant billboard in the city center showing Keisha in military uniform, with the words, "Leadership has no color, it has character." During a lecture at the Air Force Academy, Keisha was asked by a cadet how to deal with prejudice. "Young man," she replied, "let them underestimate you." While he spends his energy doubting her abilities, she uses that same energy to develop skills he can never question. Keisha's story inspired an entire generation of young military personnel from minority backgrounds. His book Flying Through the Storms became a bestseller, with all proceeds going toward aviation scholarships. 3 years later, Richard ran into Keisha at an airport. She was wearing a general's uniform, surrounded by aides and security guards. He was wearing his blue dealership uniform, carrying a small, inexpensive suitcase. "General Washington," he said timidly, "I would like to properly apologize for what happened on that flight." Keisha studied him for a moment, seeing not the arrogant man from before, but someone genuinely broken by his own ignorance. "Mr. Blackwood, you gave me the greatest gift possible that day." "How so?" "You reminded me why I do what I do. Every person I save, every pilot I train, every barrier I break, all of it is possible because people like you exist to motivate me to prove them wrong." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I lost everything because of his prejudices." "No, sir," Keisha corrected him gently. "You discovered you never had anything real to lose. Privilege is not achievement. Respect is not inheritance. Competence is not appearance." As she walked away with her team, Richard realized the hardest lesson of his life. The woman he had judged incapable of flying a plane now commanded entire squadrons, while he, who considered himself superior, could barely command his own existence. Keisha's true revenge was not to destroy Richard Blackwood. It was to build a legacy so brilliant that it rendered his pettiness irrelevant. She learned that success is not only the best revenge, it is the only revenge worth having. As she said in her last interview, "While they spend time underestimating us, we spend that time becoming unforgettable." Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life? Leave your story of overcoming adversity in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that prove that greatness doesn't ask permission to shine.